and welcome back to this tutorial series where we go over the various options available to 5th edition campaigns within Fantasy Grounds Unity. In this video, we will be going over the options that primarily control how Fantasy Grounds itself controls, setups, and displays information related to combat encounters through visual or audio representations and how combat itself flows. However, due to the number of options involved in this section, I will most likely be breaking this video up into 2 smaller videos to ensure that each has a relatively short duration. With that, let's get started. The first option we are going to look at is the Combat Ally Health Player Display option. The setting has 3 potential configurations, allowing you to choose between status, off, or detailed, which is the default. This controls how much detail another player is going to see about their allies' health-related stats within the combat tracker. When using the detailed setting, the combat tracker is going to contain 3 potential columns in relation to the ally stats, and this information is going to be related to the overall health of any ally in your party. This is going to include their maximum hit points, how many temporary hit points they have, and how many wounds they have suffered. However, when we change the setting to status, you will see that we only get 1 column here, and that is the overall status of a particular ally. And it's going to contain words. And these words are going to be healthy, wounded, heavy, and dying within that actual space. However, the combat wound category setting actually increases the level of detailed health statuses that you can have. And I will cover that in more detail when we get to that particular option. When the setting is set to off, you will notice that the status column for your allies goes away, and you will also see that it doesn't affect any of the hostile NPCs that are currently in the combat tracker. I myself like to use the actual status setting, and I find that's a good balance between too much detail and not enough. However, when you have this setting set to off, what it's going to do is encourage your players to communicate a lot more about their overall health state, thus ensuring that there's a role-playing level of communication going on, specifically around that topic. The next option is called Combat Auto NPC Initiative, and it affects the initiative roles of NPCs as they are added to the combat tracker, and it has 3 options: Group, which is the default, On, and Off. When using the group setting, and when adding 1 or more NPCs to the combat tracker, the initiative roles will be rolled on a group-by-group basis based on the type of creature. For example, if I were to add this demo encounter to the combat tracker here, you can see that we have 3 hill giants and 5 ogres. They're 2 different types of creatures. And if I go through and add them, you will see that the hill giants all have an initiative roll of 6, whereas the ogres all have an initiative roll of 1. The order the creatures are added is not important, as it's the creature type that is going to trigger when the random roll occurs, and specifically when the first creature of that type is added to the combat tracker. So if I go ahead and add in, say, another ogre into our grouping here, it's also going to acquire the number 1 for its initiative roll. When I change this setting to on, that changes how the initiative roll is actually going to be rolled. Watch what happens now when I go ahead and add in this same demo encounter. You will see that each creature has its own, well, generally, its own initiative roll. It just so happens that these 2 happen to roll the exact same roll. However, if I go ahead and add in another ogre, it's going to go ahead and roll another initiative roll of its own. And in this case, it was the 19. If I add another hill giant, you can see that it as well also rolled, I think it was the 8 here that got rolled in this particular case. With the setting off, what will actually happen now when I go through and add this encounter to our combat tracker is that no initiative rolls are going to be rolled, even if I go ahead and add in another ogre after the fact. The way that you actually set it up so that these will roll here is you have to go to this menu, over to the initiative at the 9 o'clock position of this radial menu, and then you can choose one of these 3 options here, or you can just simply clear all initiatives. But if you're looking to just simply roll NPC-related initiatives, this is the option that you're going to want to go ahead and do. However, what it will do is it will also include allies in that. So if you notice that the Ape 1 and the Hound of Ill Omen also happen to roll their initiatives, that's because they are not classified as player characters. And that's perfectly fine, and it's normal behavior, because the only other options that you have here, in case you didn't know this, was roll all initiatives, as well as roll PC initiatives. This is a great option for when you're staging creatures into the combat tracker before you need them, because you can then come back at a later point in time and then roll their initiatives. It's a little bit trickier to do, but it generally allows for a little bit more freedom. I personally, when I'm starting out with a campaign and I've got a number of low creatures, I will use the on setting. And the reason for that is because I have found in the past that when you use the group setting for level 1 characters, you tend to wipe them a little bit quicker. That's not always fun. So by having it set to on, each of the creatures gets an individual role, thus balancing out the overall breakdown, if you will, of the combat order. Later on, as they get up to levels 5 and maybe 6, I will switch it to the group setting so that I can now handle everything in group, because at that particular point in time, the story has a lot more elements that are related to it, and I want to focus less on the combat mechanics and more on the story. The third option that we'll cover is called Combat Enemy Health Player Display, and it is very similar to the Combat Ally Health Player Display option that we discussed earlier, but instead it relates to any creature that is considered hostile to the party. Once again, it has 3 settings: Detailed, Status, and Off, and the status one is the default in this particular case. This option behaves exactly the same as the Combat Ally Health Player Display option, but as you can see, when set to Detailed, you can see a lot more information in relation to that particular NPC character. Specifically, you can see their maximum number of hit points, how many temporary hit points they have been granted, as well as how much damage they have suffered, or how many wounds they have suffered. In my mind, this leaks way too much information to the players, and it is not one I will readily use until I have a group of players who have trust issues while running a particular campaign, though that has been extremely rare. When the setting has been switched to Status, you can see that you have the wording that indicates the overall health state of a particular NPC character, much like we saw earlier. And again, it's the same category of words: healthy, wounded, heavy, and dying. And once again, the combat wound categories will adjust how many of those words exist in that particular status field. So additional ones are added when you go to a different setting, but we'll get to that in a bit. When off, you can see that there is absolutely zero indication to the players about the overall health of that particular NPC creature. And I will generally use this setting when I'm looking at enforcing a little bit of role-playing between myself and the players, in the sense that I want to be able to describe to the players exactly what they're seeing in relation to the overall health of that particular creature. For example, let's say that the party is attacking one of these ogres and I get asked the question, what does the condition of that ogre look like? Do they look like they're about to go down, or do they look like that they are in okay condition? I might reply to that player with, you see that the ogre has a large number of superficial cuts that don't seem to be affecting them at all. And it's a good way to explain to the players that that particular ogre, while they have suffered a few hits, they've all been relatively minor bits of damage and they're still in really tip-top condition. Now, let's say it's a little bit later in the combat round and I get asked that question around that particular ogre and they've suffered significant wounds. Then what I might do is explain, you see that this ogre has a large number of very deep gashes that are bleeding profusely, and they seem to be struggling in order to actually engage in combat in relation to the overall scenario. That's a great way to visually describe that this particular ogre is literally on the verge of going down. They're struggling, they've suffered a large number of hits, they've taken a massive amount of damage, and it's only a matter of time before they go down. The next option, called Combat NPC Numbering, also has 3 settings. It is Append, which is the default setting, Random, and Off. And what it does is it controls the labeling of the creatures. You can see here that I've gone ahead and I've cleared out all of the earlier creatures and I've added in a brand new encounter. That's the same encounter, just I've reset it essentially. But what you can see here is there's now a sequential numerical prefix that has been added to each of the creatures in the combat tracker. And that's exactly what Append does. It starts at 0, but once the first creature is added, that creature gets a 1 after its label, and then each creature has a new label that is incremented by 1. And I call this the labeling suffix. When you use the append setting, it is going to continue to increase each of these values by 1. So if you throw in 100 creatures into this particular combat tracker, and they're all the same creature, you will have 1 through 100 for the representation of those particular labels. When you're making use of the random option, what will happen here is that it will randomly generate a value that gets appended to the end of that particular creature's name. So we see here that we have a 5, a 9, a 10, a 16, and a 19 for our ogres. This is a great way to hide how many creatures are actually there in relation to what the players physically see. And what I mean by that is if you look at the player's combat tracker, right now there are no creatures that are displayed. But let's say ogres 10 and 16 have approached the party, but ogres 19, 5, and 9 have actually stayed behind and are not immediately visible or detected by the actual player characters. If the players see that there's Ogre 16 here and there's Ogre 10, they go, oh, there might actually be 16 ogres here, people, and then make a decision as to whether they're going to engage those particular ogres in combat or whether they're going to try to flee and just do a sort of like a retreat as part of this particular process. Now let's say that Ogre 5 has approached. That might reinforce that idea because now you're indicating to them that there is a lower valued ogre here. What you're not actually hinting to them or telling them is that there's only 5 ogres here. So there's a bit of risk that they have to go through and make a decision as to whether they stick around and continue to fight or whether they run away. I actually don't know how Fantasy Grounds Unity figures out what range of values to use here. I've never actually talked to Smiteworks about that. Now, when this setting is off, no label is going to be appended to the end of the creature's name, and it's going to get very confusing, which is why the default setting is append, because it allows you and the party to identify to each other which particular ogre or hill giant in this particular case that the party is going to be actually attacking. If they all are just simply labeled ogre, well, that gets a little bit ambiguous. My personal favorite is the random setting, and it allows me to provide a degree of uncertainty to the particular party in relation to how many creatures are actually there. Because I have the ability to hide creatures from their capability to see them in the combat tracker, they really don't know whether I have some reserves, if you will, in the backgrounds that are going to come in later on in the combat. The last option that affects the visual representation for the combat tracker is called combat wound categories, and it has 2 settings: simple, which is the default, as well as detailed. The simple setting displays the status values that we have already seen in relation to NPCs or even players when configured to do so. Heavy, wounded, dying, and healthy are the primary categories, and it's roughly around 25% in relation to when those categories change. When the option is set to detailed, however, you can see now that without changing the actual damage to any of the creatures, we now have a heavy, light, and dying. Well, there's actually another option in there called moderate. So if I go ahead and make an adjustment here, I think it's this one. Yeah, you will see that it will now operate at moderate. And I think it averages out to be around 20% in relation to the actual damage, because I set that to 49 and it was a 50 prior, and that made the adjustment. The actual listing is healthy, light, moderate, heavy, critical, and dying in that order. So there is a few more states. In fact, there's only 2 additional states there, light and moderate, that get added to it when you make use of the detail. But it provides a little bit more granularity in the overall state of a given creature, regardless of whether it's an ally or whether it's an NPC, depending on how you're displaying it in the combat tracker. These 2 settings affect that level of detail for both the players, if you happen to set their player view to be status as opposed to detailed like I have here, as well as for the NPCs when they're set to status. We are now going to move on to a setting that is going to directly affect how much damage an NPC is going to do in relation to other creatures in the combat tracker, and it's called NPC rolls, variable, or fixed. And as you can guess by its name, it's going to either use a fixed value in relation to the amount of damage it's going to do to another creature, or it's going to roll dice in order to actually figure out how much damage it's going to do. If you're unsure what I mean by that, you can go ahead and take a look at any creature's stat block to determine what I mean. You're going to want to focus on this area here, any reference that is after a hit. There are actually 2 sets of values here. You have an 18 or you have a 3d8 plus 5. When the setting is configured as fixed, it's going to do the 18 points of damage. However, when the setting is set to variable, it's going to roll dice using 3d8 as the roll rule and add 5 to that value. So I've gone ahead and I have set this up as the fixed value. And as soon as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and roll this great club for the giant here. Let's say that they have hit this barbarian. I'm going to simply drag and drop, and it's going to look like that I'm actually rolling dice. But what you are going to see is that it's a static value that comes up. It's the 18 that we saw earlier. You also saw that no dice were actually rolled. And I'm going to do that again just to show you. Even though you've picked up dice, it doesn't actually roll them. When the setting is configured as variable, you can go ahead and pick up the dice, drop it onto your target, and it's going to roll those dice. And as you can see here, I've done it twice. I now have 2 different values that I had potentially rolled in relation to the damage. So you might be asking, why would you ever use the fixed setting? Well, what it does is it gives you the ability to provide a sort of consistent status to the players as to how much damage they are going to suffer whenever they take a damage from that hill giant. If a player has 40 hit points, they've already suffered 18 points of damage. That means that they have roughly 22 hit points left. If, however, they don't want to risk it, they can actually use this opportunity to either disengage and suffer no attack of opportunity, or take that risk and allow that particular hill giant to hit them with an attack of opportunity, knowing that they're still going to suffer 18 points of damage, but they might get the ability to run away. If the player only has 36 total hit points and they suffer 18 points of damage, they can only soak up one more hit before they're actually going down. In fact, the next hit will knock them down. And I've seen some players make use of that moment and turn it into a hero moment, in the sense that they know there's the risk that they're going to get hit, but they're keeping that ogre engaged or that hill giant engaged in order to ensure that it doesn't attack the rest of the party. It really comes down to that. When you're using the variable option, the player has no idea as to a reference in relation to how much damage they could potentially suffer. That hill giant might roll 3 1s on that dice, and thus convincing the player that, oh, I suffered 8 points of damage. I'm not going to take too much in the way of damage from this particular hill giant. It seems to be weaker than I was expecting. And then all of a sudden you come around and you hit them for 22 hit points because you rolled 3 8s. Actually, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 24. You could actually hit them higher. But anyway, you get the point. All of a sudden that player's going, oh crap, this guy's stronger than I was expecting. So there's a little bit more risk involved with the variable option. Which option you're going to use is still entirely up to you, although you are going to want to have a conversation with the party to let them know, hey, I'm using a variable amount of damage here, which means there's a higher level of risk as to getting higher rolls versus low rolls. Whereas if I use the fixed option, you'll at least know a consistent result as opposed to what that roll is going to be, and then have a discussion around that and see what they're comfortable with. The next option is called player ring bell on turn, and it is a reasonably simple option, and it generally has 2 settings, on or off. It is used to notify players through an audible alert on their system when their turn has come around in the combat tracker. So if I use our player character here as an example, and I go ahead and I select next actor, you can hear that chime in the background. That chime is an indication to the player that their turn has come around, and they can go ahead and do whatever it is they're going to do on their particular turn. When they themselves pass the token on to the next player, then that other player is now going to hear that chime. As the Dungeon Master, I won't hear that chime. Only the player is going to hear that chime. And the only reason you're hearing it on my system is because I have a player connected that is directly associated with that particular barbarian, even though I don't have the barbarian physically loaded on that particular character's console. With the setting off, however, there is no chime that comes around and indicates to the player that it is their turn. So if I go ahead and I now move this to the next actor again, you'll see that there is no sound. So a player is going to have to be very attentive during the combat scenario in order to realize that their turn has come around, or the Dungeon Master is going to have to prod them. I generally encourage my players to actually pay attention while in combat, because there could be something that could affect them that if they're not paying attention, they might not realize, oh wait, what the heck just happened? The last option that we are going to cover as part of this video is called player show turn order. And it has 3 possible settings: friendly, which is the default, off, and all. And it changes how the players see the order of creatures in the combat order, specifically within the combat tracker. The all option is the default setting, and it will allow a player to see the initiative roll of every single creature that is in the combat tracker and the order that that particular combat situation is going to occur in. And in case you were unaware of this, the combat tracker orders these values from highest to lowest, which should be obvious. This is a great setting to use, as it's going to reduce the overall amount of confusion a player is going to have when that particular action token is moving about the combat tracker, specifically this token right here, this little black dragon that's on the side of the combat tracker. However, it's only going to come into play if a given hostile NPC is actually visible on the combat tracker. So if you've gone ahead and hidden an ogre, they're not going to show up in this particular list. And when the player passes their token on to the next actor in the combat tracker, what you will actually see is that it moves on to this particular ogre here. Well, in fact, it actually skipped the ogre that was hidden, depending on the setting. So if you have the setting that doesn't do that, it will actually sit there on that ogre, but they won't see it in the combat tracker as to where it is. But I'm not going to cover that setting here. I'm going to cover that in another video. When using the friendly setting, it's going to organize the combat tracker so that the party and their allies is listed at the top of the combat tracker, from a player's point of view, and you will only see the values and the order of that particular combat order in relation to the allies. A dungeon master is still going to see the order in the order that it is in. It's only going to be the players that are affected in relation to this particular change in view. In relation to the hostile NPCs, the players can no longer see the value of that initiative roll, and they can no longer see the order that those particular creatures are in. If I move the combat tracker from the ape to the next target, or actor I should say, in the combat tracker, you'll see that it has jumped down to the second hill giant before jumping up to the first hill giant and then jumping down to the last one. So the order is now not necessarily known by the player as to which particular creature is going to go when. This is probably what is considered the best setting in relation to this, because it is still going to provide your players enough information to be able to allow them to know what the order their own players are going to go in so that they can plan a coordinated sort of event or attack of some kind. And it is the setting that I generally go with. When set to off, however, zero information is provided to the players as to the order of the combat situation. You can no longer see any other player's initiative. In fact, you can't even see your own. Only the dungeon master has any level of visibility as to what that value is, as well as to what that order is, whereas the players now simply will see an alphabetical list by group, whether it's hostile or not hostile, in relation to the creatures. It's the perfect setting to use when, as a dungeon master, you're trying to really control the battlefield and provide a certain level of stress to the party that will ramp up the adrenaline concerns of those players, as they won't have any idea as to who goes when. It is also going to allow you, the dungeon master, to place the turn token wherever you want it to be. And that is really in the event that maybe your party is suffering really badly at the hands of a particular dragon and you decided to skip that dragon's turn. You might just choose to skip them to give those players one last attempt to either save themselves, get out of it, or continue to attack the dragon before they're completely obliterated because you now happen to have the breath weapon back for that particular dragon. If you move that dragon temporarily to the end of their turn and allow the players to make a decision and either vacate or continue to engage that dragon, then the onus becomes on them that they made the decision to stay when you completely wipe them out. And when it's off, it's also good for a dungeon master who likes to run a little bit more of a freeform kind of combat scenario, because the players don't necessarily know the order, even though you might have the initiative turned on. With that in mind, however, I'm going to end this video here. I think I'm at around 24-25 minutes, and I really want to keep this one under 30 minutes if possible. So we will cover the remaining combat elements in the next video, and I look forward to seeing you in that video.